Hi, so this is a summary of the 2022-23 annual funding survey. Just wait for a few minutes to make sure everyone's in. Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining this session. It's a look into the findings from the 2022-23 annual funding survey. Just wait a couple of minutes to see if there's anyone else joining us. There's a few more people joining us now. Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining me. This is a summary of the 2022-23 annual funding survey findings. I'll just wait for another minute or two. I'll just wait till 2 minutes past and then we'll kick off because I know everyone's very busy. Thanks for joining us this morning for a look at the annual funding survey findings. Right, we'll maybe kick off. Thanks again for joining us. So my name's Graham Stevenson and I work in the Strategic Development Department. There's a few more people joining us now. You're very welcome. I'm just going to kick off because I know everyone's a bit strapped for time. So I appreciate you joining me this morning to run through of the findings from the annual funding survey. This is formatted as a webinar, so there's not much opportunity for interaction. So I'd maybe suggest that you use the Q&A function if you do have any questions rather than the chat function. It's just me this morning, so although Leanne is sitting in the background making sure things run smoothly. But if you do have any questions, there is an opportunity at the end of the session for questions. So if you wouldn't mind waiting till then, that would be great. So yeah, as I said, my name's Graham Stevenson. I work in strategic development at the Arts Council. I am just going to run through slides here. So just to provide a bit of context or background to the survey, it's a survey of the annual funding programme, which is the largest single investment made by the Arts Council each year. And it collects data on organisation profiles, staffing, finances, audiences and activities, as a lot of you already know because you complete the survey, which is very good of you. Its purposes are to provide evidence for the use of our funding for reporting to government and wider stakeholder group. And it's also to support our understanding of the organisations that we fund as well. The Northern Ireland portfolio is quite diverse in terms of the types of organisations that we support. And it's also to inform the Arts Council's strategy and business planning processes. A lot of the data that we gather here, which is primarily quantitative, is used to support, for example, business cases It's also to provide funded organisations with benchmark data. For example, if organisations are looking to benchmark their activity at an art form or sector level, we can provide you with that data. In 2022-23, there were 95 organisations funded. That was down 2 organisations. On the previous year, they received £14.7 million in Exchequer funding, but also lottery sources as well. So it was combined lottery and Exchequer sources. The data presented is captured independently of the Arts Council by a third-party organisation, but it's validated and cleaned by the Arts Council. In terms of the classifications that we use, and these are the 2 which I used through this presentation, we used the art form classifications and also organisation size as well. I'm just going to jump down here. Yeah, the art form, combined arts receives the largest share by art form, but it's distributed amongst more organisations. As you can see, 5.4 million is distributed amongst 33 organisations. Music receives slightly less in terms of the distribution, but it's distributed amongst a smaller number of organisations. So on average, those organisations receive more of the pot. So we're using these, I wonder, and also in terms of the scale of organisations, this is another method we use to analyse the data. And organisations are classified into large, medium or small, depending on the total income that they receive. So large organisations over 800,000, medium between 200 and 800,000, and small less than 200,000. And that's the split of organisation by size. Okay. So these are the areas I'm going to cover in the presentation this morning. So I'm going to look at the overall workforce, social identity, characteristics of that workforce. So looking at gender, age, disability, and ethnicity. We'll also be looking at the finances, so income and expenditure, and also the audiences and activity, looking at the patterns of engagement, the accessibility, cross-sector engagement, and activity outside Northern Ireland, which is a new area that we're covering this year. So to start off with, just to look at the workforce. Key findings overall are that employment levels, that's combined contract and permanent employment, remain slightly lower than pre-COVID levels. Overall employment levels saw a 36% increase year on year compared to last year, with a particularly strong growth in contract employment. Part-time contract employment grew significantly, and employment levels in large-scale organisations, so that's over £800,000 in terms of income, grew substantially, but fell for smaller scale organisations. So we break down that data, and just to explain, first of all, that there's a difference between counting employees, which is a measure of people compared to jobs or posts, where one person may have multiple jobs in the same organization or different organizations. So this is the count of the jobs or posts, not the individual employees. So it's worth remembering that. So it sort of plays out the picture that there's a huge reliance, if you like, on contract working in the sector, especially in part-time areas. This, I suppose, provides flexibility for the employer, but it's less secure for the individual being employed. Permanent employment, year on year, these figures here are increasing also, but less quickly, at a slower rate than those employed on contract basis. And as you can see, there's been a huge increase in the proportion of those employed on a contract basis in a full-time and part-time basis. So these are the totals for each of those two areas, the permanent and the contract. And overall, as I mentioned, all staff or all jobs or posts have increased by 36%. And that's slightly down on the pre-pandemic, pre-COVID levels, which were about 7,500. So moving on, this is the change in the last year on year in terms of employment by job type. I really put it in just to highlight how important contract of artists are, and just at scale relative to other forms of employment, and how it's changed year on year. So growth from just over 3,000 to 4,700, which is significant growth. Employment in all other areas remains or is up, but just to a lesser extent. So here is that same data presented by organisation size. And as you can see, employment has been primarily within large organisations, so those with income over 800,000. It's grown marginally for medium-scale organisations, but as you can see, for small-scale organisations, employment has fallen slightly. This is the same data by art form, just to interpret that. Obviously, as this slide in terms of distribution of funding showed, the largest number of organisations operate within the combined art form area. So it's right to see that employment has grown most within that art form area. It's grown for a number of sectors. That's circus and street carnival. Dance has fallen slightly. Drama has fallen slightly. Literature has increased. Music, again, slight decrease. Trade arts increased, as has visual arts. So just moving on. So this is contract employment by art form, and it shows a very similar picture in terms of the overall trends. That's the data by contract employment by organisation size. Again, very similar picture. A slight fall off again in terms of small scale organisations. increases for large and medium scale organizations. And that's the same, sorry, that's the permanent staff employed by Artform area. It shows a slightly different picture in terms of trends, slight reduction in employment across all Artform areas, which maybe suggests a tendency for organisations to shift their employment from permanent to contract. And there is the same picture by organisation size, slight increase overall for large-scale organisations. So again, this is permanent staff by organisation size. Slight fall off for medium scale, and again, quite a significant reduction in terms of those employed on a permanent basis for small scale organisations. So those are the overall workforce numbers. Now I'm going to look at the workforce characteristics after a sip of water. So in terms of, so I've looked at the numbers, so now we're going to look at the characteristics of that workforce. And I suppose in terms of the key findings in this area of the survey, there's just over 1% of the overall workforce, of the reported workforce, reported as non-binary. The age profiles tend towards a slightly more youthful workforce, with exception of those employed as managers. 1 in 13 of the workforce reported having a disability overall, and 8% of the workforce was from a minority ethnic background. So just to unpack that data a bit more for you. This is a look at gender by contract type. It's based on a sample of just over 5,000 responses, but it will be important to say that quite a large proportion, around 23%, described or responded as prefer not to say or unknown. So we're only working based on a sample of the overall portfolio. So it's just to point that out. The employment, when we look at it, is largely binary. So it's mainly those that describe themselves as man or woman for all employment types. But as you can see, it's a larger proportion of women within managerial roles, slightly more men within specialist and artist capacities, slightly more women in other roles, and other relates to front of house and administrative capacities. But overall, it's largely similar for those describing themselves as men or women. So there's really been very little change in composition compared to the previous year. The proportion of those describing themselves as non-binary, which is an umbrella term for people whose identity falls outside the binary of male and female. If you look at it by employment type, others have the largest proportion of those describing themselves as non-binary. So that's front of house staff and administrative staff. That's followed closely by artists at 1.17%. Specialists at 0.59% described themselves as non-binary, and managers was 0.01%. So it was largely binary, so man and women. I said there was very little shift in the overall difference between this year and last year. A 0.34% increase in the proportion describing themselves as non-binary, which is a very small increase, but an increase nonetheless. So I haven't used particularly good colours here, but I think it shows in broad terms, these are the age classifications within each of those employment areas. Again, a large proportion of the sample, well, this is just based on a sample of the overall portfolio, because around 45%, 41% describe themselves as unknown or prefer not to say. And the age profiles are slightly different for each employment type. You've got a larger proportion here. This is the age 45 to 54 category, for those that operate within managerial capacities. And it shifts for specialists down to a slightly younger age category, 34 to 44. And for artists, a slightly younger again, so that's 25 to 34-year-olds is the peak there. So as I said, the trend over the last 3 years, maybe I didn't say it, towards a more youthful workforce overall, with the exception of managers. This could be skewed slightly by the artist workforce. But there is evidence in the wider Northern Ireland workforce of increasing inactivity amongst 50 plus post-COVID. So it will be interesting to keep an eye on that data to see if that's borne through in our survey data as well. Just a quick look at the changes in the age groupings compared to last year. So it's marginal, but it does suggest that these older groups within managerial areas are growing. So the age group of managers is slightly aging, while those of a younger age is falling. Slightly mixed within these areas here, specialists, artists, and other, which is becoming slightly more youthful. But overall, you can maybe just say that the overall population is becoming slightly more youthful overall, but it is just marginal. So to move on to disability, again, I should say that this is only based on a smaller sample of the portfolio. And I should move on the slide as well. This is just based on a sample of the overall population. If you look at the overall figures on the right-hand side here, you can see that 1 in 13 of the workforce describe themselves as having a disability. Now that would be underrepresented compared to the Northern Ireland Society, society-wide, where at the last census, around 1 in 4 described themselves as having a limiting long-term health problem or disability. Now, we do use a social model of disability, so the question's slightly different, but I think in broad terms, you can draw some comparison to that statistic. So in comparison, there are fewer disabled people working within the AFP workforce, but think we should remember that this is just based on a sample, and people may not want to report the fact that they have a disability, given the sensitivity of the data. I should say that so these statistics are based on only 43% of the workforce. So there are two broad points, I suppose, to point out from this. Perhaps a reluctance to report disability by employees, and also the limited capacity of reporting organisations to collect and report it. So our focus is going to be trying to increase the sample that we gather this data from to make it more representative of the sector. And there is some variability depending on employment type. For others, it's 1 in 7. For artists, it's 1 in 18. Specialists, it's 1 in 14. And managers, it's 1 in 8. But I would just remember that point around representation and reporting that I mentioned. In terms of changes in disability levels compared to the previous year, seen an increase in those reporting they have a disability. For others, and also managers, a slight decrease in those reporting themselves as having a disability amongst specialists, artists, and that feeds through to the overall figure, which is down slightly. Yeah, so to move on to ethnicity, as I said, 8% of the overall workforce reported as from a ethnic minority background. It was highest amongst the artists population and lowest amongst the managers. Again, there's some concern about how representative this is, as it's only based on 55% of the workforce. Now, compared, just to provide this a general comparison, in the census, last census, around 3.45% of the population was from an ethnic minority background. So on that basis, a higher proportion of our workforce is from ethnic minority backgrounds. And there are the changes in ethnic minority representation over the last 2 years. So there has been a slight increase across all employment types, in particularly amongst specialists. And I'll just touch on board compositions. So we also gathered data in terms of this background at the board level. So the 700 board members across the 95 organisations funded. 1 in 7 reported having a disability. 4% were from an ethnic minority background, and 0.4% reported themselves as non-binary. Okay. And there's just a quick look at the age profile of the board, which tends to be older than the overall workforce population. You can see here it peaks in the 55 to 64 age group. So we'll move on to look at the finance. The finance data that's reported. We look at the income and expenditure profiles of organisations. And this is a summary of the key findings. The small and medium scale organisations seem particularly vulnerable post-COVID, relying on public sector and philanthropic income sources. Earned income levels now exceed pre-pandemic levels, particularly for large-scale organisations. They tend to be the larger venues. Excuse me. Core costs have increased by 42% at an average of just over 21,000 for small-scale organisations, and programming costs, excuse me, has increased by 38% for large-scale organisations. So just to look at the this is trend data over the last 5 years. So the overarching trends in income and expenditure by revenue stream. So the hatch lines are the expenditure. Blue hatch line is the core costs, and the green hatch lines are the program costs. I should make out that this is not adjusted for inflation. But the highlight, I suppose, is that this is the 2021, so that's the COVID year, or the year in which the majority of COVID was. There was a huge, as you can see, in terms of the blue line here, which is the earned income, there was a huge fall off here, as you would imagine, in terms of earned income that year, and increase in income in terms of earned income post-COVID. But this really only benefits the large-scale organisations with box office income generating streams. Costs seem to be rising at a faster rate relative to public sector level income. And by public sector level income, I mean that income from government department agencies, Northern Ireland local authorities, and also European funding programs as well. It was more helpful to express this data as an average, given the different number of organisations comprising each group. But as you can see, there's a huge disparity in the ability of organisations to earn income depending on their size. So the greenish column here are the large-scale organisations. The blue is the medium, and the white is small scale. And as you can see from the data, earned income compared to 2018 is still down for all three sizes of organisations. Yep, so there's the 2022 figure there. So for large scale, it's down 17%, for medium scale, 56%, and for small scale, 43%. But the most significant area there is the amount of earned income for large scale organisations. And this slide shows the average public sector income by organisation size. And it's quite variable depending on the classification you're looking at. For large-scale organisations, you can see over this 5-year period that public sector income has increased and peaked there at 2021. So that was the COVID year when public sector income was mainly used to keep organisations in the sector operating. So it doesn't surprise me that public sector income peaked that year and has fallen off slightly since. For medium scale organisations, there seems to be a downward trend across the 5-year period, although it did increase between 2021 and 2022-23. And that was a similar trend, although at a much lower level for small-scale organisations. We've seen a gradual decrease, although there was a slight increase in the last 2 years. So just to look at the overall changes in core cost over the last 2 years, a lot of those are non-discretionary. So as you can see, huge increase in salary costs, light and heating, printing, postage and stationery costs. This is just over the last 2 years. Lighting and heating increasing by, increasing by, that's the wrong slide, increasing by 50%, which is considerable. Yeah, those are the average core costs by organisation size. And in the majority of cases, there was a slight decrease up to COVID this year, and then obviously they've taken off as given the cost of living crisis in subsequent years. Core costs have remained quite steady for medium and small scale organisations, but I think that's perhaps largely due to organisations trying to reduce their costs in non-discretionary or in discretionary areas. As we can see here, these are non-discretionary areas, so artist costs, publicity, marketing and promotion. There's a reduction in some of these areas where organisations are trying to cut back on areas of spend to try and protect their core activity areas. And there's a slide just showing that by organisation size. Again, a slight reduction in the years leading up to COVID, and then increased there after COVID. So that's the finances. So we'll just have a quick look at the audiences and also the activity as well. So the key findings here would be that the number of in-person activities, this is face-to-face activities, is now at 86% of the 18-19 pre-COVID levels. But the number of performances delivered now exceeds pre-COVID levels. In-person audiences and participant engagement is at 92% of the 18-19 levels across all activity types. And audiences for performances now exceeds pre-COVID levels. So the number of online products delivered has fallen by 62% compared to 2021. And communications-based access support has also fallen year on year. So just to drop into some of that data. So this is a look at the number of activities delivered over a 5-year period at an individual event level. So, for example, number of performances at say the Grand Opera House, or workshops delivered. So that's participation-based activity. for example, with community groups. And obviously that's the COVID year, so there was very little activity there. So the overall number of activities is now 86% of 18-19 levels. And you can see a predominance of participation in performance-based activities. So the light green here, the number of performances. And as I mentioned, those now exceed 18-19 levels substantially. The number of participation-based events, there tend to be more of them because they're smaller in scale. But as you can see also, they have increased post-COVID, but still some way short of activity levels that were delivered in 18-19. So these are the associated audiences for those activities that were in the previous slide. Now, this is a measure of overall audience engagements and not in an individual count. So it's important to remember that, and it's in millions as well. Now, I presented this data at an overall level, and it's a combination of known data and also estimated data. We can place a greater reliance on known sources of data because it comes from box office systems. Estimated figures is, as it suggests, just more of an estimate. So that's a sum of both those counts, so combined known and estimated. So as we can see, for performances, the number of people attending performances has now exceeds pre-COVID levels slightly. Number of participants is slightly down on pre-COVID levels. That's the 2022-23 levels. And it's the same for exhibitions and also festivals, although that's a slight outlier there, 1.8 million in 1920. We go on to look at online products between 2020, 21 and 22, 23. Number of organisations delivering online products has fallen from 71 to 50, and the number of products from 59 down to 22, which is quite a significant drop-off. It'll be interesting to see next year's data, see if that trend continues. It may well be that organisations are using both in-person but also online products, more of a blended approach possibly, but as you can see, online products are falling, possibly because they're generating less income in terms of box office. Just to touch on the role of resource organisations and their role within the ecosystem or within the arts sector in Northern Ireland. A core of 25 organisations provided support for individuals and organisation members, some with fee-paying members. A significant number of individual paying members here as a proportion of total number of the members, to around 85%. And in terms of the services delivered or provided by those organisations, and the resource organisations support different parts of the Northern Ireland sector. Some provide supports for specific art form areas, some provide support for organisations, regardless of the art form that they operate in. And the range of supports resource organisations provide is quite diverse. The total number of services provided has increased by 17% over the last 2 years, which I think is quite significant. And it maybe suggests that the function and role of resource organisations in terms of providing these services has increased over that period, as perhaps organisations previously may have provided these services in-house, for example, around marketing and promotional support, are now looking for support or services offered by resource organisations instead. I've gone the wrong way there. So yeah, this is a relatively new question we've only asked in the last 2 years of the survey, but it really looks at the methods used by organisations to improve access for disabled people, in particular, I suppose specifically for Northern Ireland venues, and the columns here are a count of organisations providing these services. And I just highlighted there, we're working in 22-23 with slightly fewer number of organisations, but the change on the right hand side, positive is in the green and the negative is red. And there's been an overall reduction in communication supports, with the worrying decline in organisations providing captioning support, but also an increase in certain types of dedicated types of activity support, particularly for dementia friendly and also multi-sensory workshops. So that maybe suggests to me that organisations are maybe trying to factor back on this area of support to try and reduce costs, try and offset reductions in costs potentially. I'm sure you already know this, but just to highlight the arts organisations partner a diverse range of non-art sectors to support positive local change and enhance service delivery in other areas such as education, health, well-being and regeneration. And this graph just interprets that work, if you like. Very little change compared to the previous year, but slightly more organisations are working within regeneration contexts. Similarly, within criminal justice area and also libraries. But it's good to see that there are a lot of organisations working within local authority contexts. And also the proportion of organisations working in that area have increased. Water. So to look next at engagement with creatives and organisations outside Northern Ireland, we felt it was important to put in this question just to monitor activity post leaving the EU and within the context of the Windsor framework. And certainly it suggests that core organisations continue to work with creative in practitioners outside Northern Ireland, either by hosting them locally or delivering activities in other regions of the world as parts of more formal touring events. This dynamic obviously helps to enrich cultural practices locally, develop creative networks, and provide additional earned income. And we can see that 63 organisations, so that's of the 95, work across an all-island basis or internationally. The most significant areas is on the island of Ireland, working down south with organisations there. To a lesser extent in GB, and there's also a significant amount of engagement with organisations and creatives still within the EU context. And it's good to see further afield that organisations are still working internationally in areas outside of the EU, North America, Middle East and North America, and other areas. It would be good to have a benchmark here with activity pre-COVID, or sorry, pre-Brexit, but we don't have that, unfortunately, but we'll certainly monitor that moving forward. And in terms of the types of activity delivered here, we can see there's a high proportion of activity which is the standalone activity, not considered part of a tour. 24 organisations provided that, or delivered that within an all-island context. So the dark shade here is with organisations and creatives based in ROI. So research, hosting creative practitioners, to a lesser extent, borrowing collections for exhibitions. As I mentioned, standalone activity, not part of a tour, and also co-productions and co-commissions is also quite significant. So, yeah, we asked the question about the impact of leaving the EU, and 61% or 61 organisations, so 64% describe continued direct and indirect consequences of the UK leaving the EU, primarily around the loss of EU funding. So that's Creative Europe, Erasmus, and European Social Fund. Stricter border controls, the need to provide import declarations, carnets, VAT, cabotage, and ETA is also rearing its head moving forward. It hasn't been introduced yet, but is likely to be shortly. There's just a glitch there in the slide, but there's an increase in the haulage and shipping costs. So all those factors are combining to impact on the activities that organisations are delivering locally. Those are just some of the responses that we received back from organisations, and the impact is quite significant, or worth noting anyway. We do use this data quite a bit within various EU international liaison groups. We're working closely with the other UK arts councils through the Four Nations, developing projects like Cultural Bridges, and we're also part of the Arts InfoPoint UK, which is a really useful source of information for any of you looking to invite creatives to Northern Ireland, or perhaps move to the different parts of the EU. And we're also part of Queen's University's Civic Forum, so have direct contact with EU representatives within the EU Parliament. So we're using this data to highlight issues within those different groups. So that's the end of the presentation. So in terms of the overall conclusions, or wrapping up, the overall workforce levels, so that combines contract and permanent employments, remain lower than pre-COVID levels. Part-time contracts posts represents a larger proportion of the workforce than pre-COVID, but they tend to be more precarious and obviously may impact on employment rights as well. It's a very different picture depending on the size or scale of the organisation. Larger scale organisations growing in terms of employment. Small and medium scale organisations tended to contract in terms of their workforce area, in terms of equality, diversity and inclusion, the need to improve the reporting rates moving forward. We're only working on a sample of the overall portfolio, but based on the sample, disabled people are underrepresented, but ethnic minorities slightly higher than the Northern Ireland Society levels. In terms of activity and audiences, there's a growth in both areas since the pandemic. As I mentioned, just a question around whether the picture is accurate or not. Are organisations over-reporting or under-reporting audiences? We'll have to drill down into the detail of the data to get a more accurate picture. And obviously there's the continuing legacy in terms of leaving the EU or impact on how organisations are operating as a consequence of that. So that's it really. I mean, it would be great to hear from you guys in terms of whether you felt the presentation was useful or not, and also whether you feel we can improve the dialogue with the sector regarding the data and how we interpret the findings. We were considering setting up a working group with sector representatives to work more closely with us on the data. I'm not sure what you think about that, but if anyone does have any questions, please use the question and answer function. Will the AFS report be available to download after this? Yes, it will. Yes, it will, Paul. We have the overall report, which is available through the official statistics part of the website, and also for individual organisations. We will be developing a template in Excel, which will help you compare your own submissions year on year. So yes, we can do that for you. Any other questions? I've got visions of people typing away, but maybe that's optimism bias. No, okay, I'll just move on to look at the next steps. So move that over there. So next step, so consolidation of the postcode data that we receive to provide some spatial insights. So we'll be able to look at the extent to which activity was delivered in urban and rural areas. As I mentioned to Paul, we'll be developing Excel templates for use by reporting organisations. We may well be rolling out parts of the survey to ensure that we're collecting data from our lottery-funded clients specifically to increase the representation of the data and its representativeness of the sector. potential for setting up an AFS client group, cross-sector representative. So if you are interested in that, do give me a shout. And we'll be starting again in 22, 23, 23, 24. For the survey, will be opening again in March time. So yeah, thanks. That's about us, really. I'll just mention finally that the data is available in tabular format on the website. And if you have any specific questions or queries about the data, then do get in contact with me. But that's it for this presentation, this webinar. Thank you very much for joining. I was going to say it was great to see you, but it's great to have you see the data, and do get in contact if I can provide any more supports.